Alrighty, folks. Alert, alert. If you have experienced a ransomware incident or a covered cybersecurity incident, you now have a second federal agency that you need to report that incident to, thanks to the CIRCIA proposed rule.
I can't believe that actually worked on the mic. Anyways, it is May of 2024, and as you might be able to tell from the obnoxious megaphone, there is
if you haven't crashed your car yet, if you haven't crashed,
we haven't given you a heart attack from the excellent audio quality out of this $10 megaphone. We're talking about the CIRCIA proposed rule again because it's humongous. And we already covered the primer general overview of the rule in a previous episode. But today, we're going to talk about what actually is supposed to go inside of a CIRCIA report up to CISA. So everyone says, oh, we have to report incidents to CISA. What does that actually mean? What is the actual requirement for the content inside of those reports, which is what we're going to talk about today. But first, some housekeeping. On May 7th, we are going to do CS2 replay of my presentation from CS2 Boston, talking about the real-world security value of CMMC. I will be live in the chat there to answer all of your questions. If you weren't able to see CS2 Boston virtually or in person, we're going to replay the recording. We'll add the link below so that you can register there. It's free. And so if you have questions about the presentation or anything else, I'll be in chat. It'll take about an hour. So check that out on May 7th.
So CS2 replay, just so that I'm clear, I'm not 100% clear on what it is. Is it like sort of like the replay of your presentation and then basically additional Q&A time for you to directly answer questions that people couldn't get to?
Yeah. So it'll replay the session that I gave, and then there will be the chat function during that hour-long webinar replay essentially, and I'll be in chat live while the replay is going, so that I can answer questions as we're going through. You can listen to the presentation. You can drop your questions in chat. I'll be there to answer them live since there's limited Q&A time during the actual presentation itself. So CS2 replay, we're going to start replaying a bunch of the sessions from CS2 Boston, previous CS2s as well, but we're going to kick it off with that one. So check it out on May 7th.
My wife watches this 90 Day Fiance where they sit in the bed, like people from the show sit in the bed and watch the actual episode as it's airing. It's kind of like that. Like
was Big Ed 90 Day Fiance? Was that Big Ed?
Yeah, that's my guy, dude.
Big Ed. All right. Well, anyways, before we get into Big Ed, okay, so I posted a poll on LinkedIn, as I often do, and I asked people, I said, hey, CISA has published this CIRCIA proposed rule with a bunch of incident reporting requirements inside of it that will affect DIB contractors, among many others. People already have established incident reporting requirements in DFARS 7012 as a defense contractor or subcontractor. So should these new requirements in the CIRCIA rule, which are really requirements because they're in the CIRCIA statute, they're not just making them up, should those requirements be included in the revision to DFARS 7012 because it's going through rulemaking? So should DFARS 7012 expand so that people only have to report up to DoD instead of up to DoD and to CISA? And out of all the respondents, 61% of them said yes. 61% of people said DFARS 7012 should expand to match the new requirements in the CIRCIA proposed rule for incident reporting ransomware payments and things like that, which is interesting. It's probably the more efficient way to do things. That way people don't have to report to two different agencies. But the problem is I don't think people really understand how much stuff is involved with what's required in the content of a CIRCIA report because it's buried in the rule and it's at the very, very end. So today we're going to walk through what the rule says needs to go into a CIRCIA report. And one way or another, this is the information you're going to have to submit up to the government, whether it's through one agency or multiple agencies. This is what is in store for you.
So on last week's episode, we talked about how CIRCIA would CIRCIA. I'm terrible with these.
You nailed it.
Like
you got it.
Yeah. So CIRCIA, how this would,
it's like
essentially, yeah. That's what I thought about in my head actually when I was trying to say it right. I practice. Unique New York. Anyways, so what we talked about on last week's episode, Jacob, was how the CIRCIA rule itself not only would expand reporting requirements, but the things in which organizations would have to report on, right?
Okay.
CISA wasn't particularly concerned with just your CUI boundary. They were concerned with your entire information system. So from the looks of it, based off of your poll, 61% of the people voted and agreed that it should match it. And like you said, I don't think they know exactly what goes into it, because 61% of these people that voted on this poll are saying that, yes, we think that these organizations, that DFARS 7012 should expand so that these organizations have to be aware of every system that is touching their network, period, and be able to report on it.
Yeah.
And
it's important to remember, the poll is not a referendum on whether we ought to report the things that are in the CIRCIA rule. The assumption is that the CIRCIA rule will mandate these things as being reported, because the CIRCIA statute is mandating that these things be reported. Really, it's a question of, do we want separate reporting criteria for one agency and separate reporting criteria for another agency for the same small organization for really the same information system, just under two different contexts? It's probably more efficient to have it in 7012, but it does pay to understand just how broad the scope of things that are, how much information you have to include in a CIRCIA report actually is. There's quite a bit of stuff that we have to get through, so we'll try to make it as painless as possible. For a quick review, a quick to catch everybody up on the rule, starting in section 226.1, definitions, this is all at the bottom of the rule, which we'll link to below. A covered entity is an entity that meets the criteria set forth in the applicability section, 226.2. And when you go look at the applicability section, as we've talked about before, this rule applies to you if one of two things are true. If you are either above the small business line for your particular NAICS code that is assigned by the Small Business Administration, or you have a sector-specific criterion that already causes you to be considered critical infrastructure and have other obligations. So in the case of the DIB, although most of the DIB are below the small business threshold, so they should be exempt under the first part, they have existing obligations under DFARS 7012 and their critical infrastructure sector entities. Therefore, the details of the rule apply to them. And they specifically say in the rule, providers of operationally critical support to the Department of Defense, or those who process, store, transmit covered defense information, specifically if the entity is a contractor or subcontractor required to report cyber incidents pursuant to DFARS Clause 7012, this rule applies to you. So that's a covered entity. DIB contractors and subcontractors, you got 7012, you're a covered entity, the rule applies to you. Now, a covered cyber incident, as we've talked about before, means a substantial cyber incident experienced by a covered entity. So we know we're a covered entity. What the heck is a substantial cyber incident? So they go on to say that a substantial cyber incident is one that results in one of four impacts. It has to actually result in these impacts. If you experience a cyber incident, but it doesn't result in one of these four impacts, it's not substantial, therefore it's not reportable. Well, you could voluntarily report it, I guess, but who does that? Okay, so if you experience a substantial loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a information system or a network, if you have a serious impact on the safety and resiliency of the covered entity's operational systems and processes, if you have a disruption of the entity's ability to engage in business or operations, or otherwise deliver goods and services, and then finally, unauthorized access to an information system or network or any non-public information contained inside of it that is facilitated through or caused by the compromise of a cloud service provider, a managed service provider, other third-party data hosting provider, or a supply chain compromise. So if you experience one of those very broad four impacts as a result of a cyber incident, is a substantial incident, you are a covered entity, therefore you are required to report that this thing happened. So that's the basic outline that we've covered in a previous episode, but what actually goes into the report? So as they go on in the rule, they talk about in section 226.3, .4, and .5, the required nature of the reports, the timelines for the reports, and then the deadlines for the reports. So we're going to sort of blend all these together. So reporting a covered cyber incident, remember, a substantial incident experienced by a covered entity, you have to report no later than 72 hours after reasonable belief that a covered cyber incident has occurred. this isn't any really all that different from what DFARS 7012 says, because that's a 72-hour reporting timeline as well. It's just that the triggers for what needs to be reported and the content for the report are different. Now, the other part about the CIRCIA rule is you have to report ransomware payments, which DFARS 7012 does not concern itself with at all. So if you pay a cyber crime, bunch of cyber criminals a ransom in response to a ransomware incident, you have to report that no later than 24 hours after the ransom payment has been dispersed. And you have to report ransomware payments even if they're not connected to a covered cyber incident. So even if you experience an incident, but it doesn't really disrupt you in a major way that would trigger a covered incident report, but you still pay a ransom, you still have to let them know that you paid the ransom, even if you haven't been completely disrupted.
Wait, so
those 4 impacts that we talked about, let's say that you...
Wait, hold on. I have to understand that better, right? So you're saying that you must report even if it's not a covered incident, right? So that's in a ransom payment. So basically somebody can come up and strong arm you out of a certain amount of money, say that they have some sort of leverage over you. You have to report that incident, but it's still the only reason that it qualifies is because like you didn't stop business operations. Like your business operations are still going. But it's not something major where your entire system's been seized up and locked up and you have to pay a ransom.
Let's say for instance, a ransomware, a gang shows up and instead of locking you out of their system, they show you that they have their data and they're going to publish it, right? Or they're going to do something with it. And so they're basically extorting you, saying, pay us or else we'll do this thing. They haven't disrupted your operations.
That's the word I was looking for. I said strong arm. I was looking for extortion. Makes sense.
Way, it's crime. It's all crime, right? So if you end up paying a ransom for some reason and you haven't experienced one of the 4 impacts that would constitute a substantial incident, you still have to report payment because you're still paying ransomware gangs as a critical infrastructure operator, even if your operations for whatever reason haven't been
even if it has the potential to lead to a substantial loss of confidentiality, right? Because in that extortion scheme right there, they're saying, look, I have all of this pertinent data that is very, very valuable to you, and that if it's released out into the dark webs or whatever it may be, that can be very damaging to your organization, but maybe whatever contract that you're servicing, right? So even if it has that potential to be a substantial loss, it still only qualifies because it wasn't an actual loss, right? It was just saying that we have this.
Yeah, it's just,
well, if they say that we have this data, isn't it technically it's a loss at that point, right?
It's because you're paying ransomware actors, right? Like whether there's an impact or a loss doesn't really matter to CISA at this point. Because
but do you get what I'm saying there? Like it's technically is at that point a loss of confidentiality. If somebody's showing me a sheet of paper and the sheet of paper is showing all this data that I'm sworn to protect, and if they have it and they're not supposed to have access, then that is a loss of confidentiality. So at that point in time, it's still a covered incident. I don't know. That's a wormhole.
Yeah.
Right?
Either way, the high level takeaway is if you experience a substantial incident, report within 72 hours. If you pay a ransom but haven't been impacted, however that's possible, you have to report the ransom payments no matter what within 24 hours. So then there's a third type of CIRCIA report where you have a covered incident and a ransomware payment together. You've experienced impacts and you've paid ransoms. That's within 72 hours. And then you have supplemental reports. So you have these 4 categories of reports. You have covered cyber incidents, ransom payments, covered incidents with ransom payments if they happen simultaneously, and then what are called supplemental reports. And these have to be reported what they call promptly, or let's say you experience a substantial incident and then later on, a week later, you end up paying a ransom. You have to give them a supplemental report within 24 hours because
it's connected to that event.
Because it's a ransom payment. Now, a supplemental report happens if any substantially new or different information comes out regarding the incident or the ransomware issue, or if you make a ransom payment, like I said, after previously experiencing one of these covered incidents, and then you have the option to submit a supplemental report to notify them that the incident has concluded. So those are the 4 types of reports after the 4 impacts and or ransomware incidents would occur. So let's talk about what actually goes into this report. What information do you actually give them? So under section 226.6, required manner and form of CIRCIA reports, They say a covered entity must submit CIRCIA reports to CISA through the web-based CIRCIA incident reporting form available on CISA's website. So there's going to be a form that you fill out on the website. There may be other avenues to submit information later on as approved by the director, the rule says, but primarily there will be a portal that you go to online to submit a CIRCIA report under one of those 4 categories of reports that we talked about earlier. Okay.
Already more streamlined than the DoD reporting.
DoD technically has a web portal, but this one seems like it will be a little bit more straightforward. So something to consider when we think about, who do we want to report these incidents to? Okay,
Yep.
So they break down the actual required content of a CIRCIA report in 2 different buckets. They have essentially what I would call like the boilerplate stuff that is going to apply to all CIRCIA reports. And then they've got some specific information that's required for covered incidents and for ransomware payments, right? So the boilerplate information is under section 226.7, required information for CIRCIA reports. And they say a covered entity must provide the following information in all CIRCIA reports to the extent that such information is available and applicable to the event reported, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so they want things like identification of the type of CIRCIA report submitted, ransomware, covered incident, supplemental joint, what they call a joint report. They want information like the covered entity's identity, such as full legal name, state of incorporation, affiliated trade names, organizational entity type, your address, your website, internal incident tracking numbers for the reported event, which you surely have, right? Because you have an internal incident report tracking system set up and working and operational, correct? Yes. Your applicable business numerical identifiers, the name of parent companies or organizations, and the critical infrastructure sector or sectors in which the covered entity considers itself to be included. Then they want contact information, including the full name, email address, telephone number, and title for the individual submitting the report on behalf of the covered entity, a point of contact for the covered entity if they are using a third party like your managed service provider to submit the report, or they would like to designate a preferred point of contact that is different from somebody submitting the report, and then a registered agent for the covered entity if neither the person submitting or the designated point of contact are considered to be the registered agent for the covered entity. So there's a lot of ways that they're going to get in contact with you. You're either going to say that I am the person that you reach out to because I'm submitting the report, or I'm the person that you reach out to because I'm the MSP submitting the report, or I'm submitting the report. This is the person that you're going to call for more information. So they're going to have the phone number of somebody affiliated to or delegated to talk about this incident with. And then finally, if a covered entity uses a third party to submit a CIRCIA report on the covered entity's behalf, an attestation that the third party is expressly authorized by the covered entity to submit the CIRCIA report on the covered entity's behalf. Now, we mentioned this briefly in a previous episode. This is a part that I feel like can get a little sticky between MSPs and their clients, because there's going to be an agreement that says, if you see an incident on the network and you declare that there's an incident, you are going to report to the government on behalf of our company that there is a incident occurring in a critical infrastructure sector, and you're going to give them all these details about what's going on. So I'm sure that clients at first are like, I don't want to deal with this. Like, I don't want to have to worry about this stuff. But also remember, you're allowing another company to communicate with the government about your company's cybersecurity incident posture, actions, handling, all that sort of stuff. So I feel like that's going to get a little dicey.
Do you think that there's an overall attestation that an organization submits, maybe like in a services agreement between the provider and the client, that says that, at any time that you can do that? Or do you think it's going to be case by case, where if you see this, you have this letter of attestation from the client that says you can, the covered entity, that you can report on our behalf?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not
incident 2241C 2024, right?
Yeah. I'm not an attorney, right? But it feels to me intuitively like just signing away the ability for a third party to communicate to the government that you've experienced.
I don't think anybody would do that, right?
It's probably not.
We talked about that in the last episode. Yeah, I don't think anybody's going to do that, and the reason they're going to do that is because there's going to be cases where the MSP, let's just say, we'll just use the MSP in this case, identify something that's going on, and then they have to go and say, hey, bud, this is going on with your system, and they're going to be like, oh, we can't let that get out.
Yeah.
because it's what's happening right now.
This is stuff that anybody that's worked in the DIB for any extended period of time has heard many, many stories about companies that have experienced ransomware issues, made the payments, dealt with the issue, but because their operations weren't fully disrupted, nobody ever knew about it, right? Because they're not required to report to anybody, right? They're still making parts, they're still delivering everything that's going on. This has happened quite a few times in the manufacturing space within the defense industrial base before that I've heard about over the years. And they don't tell anybody because they don't have to, right? So I just feel like that point is going to be something that MSPs and their clients are really going to have to pay attention to, because express authorization, communicating on behalf of a company to the government, those sorts of things you got to be very careful with how those things are planned out. But that's the boilerplate for whether it's a covered cyber incident report, a ransomware payment report, a joint report where you're experiencing an incident and a ransomware payment, or a supplemental report. You're going to have all this boilerplate information at the top. You want to submit your resume to the system, you got to retype your whole resume at the top of the form here. But section 226.8 is where all the details come in. So this is required information for covered cyber incident / ransomware attack reports. And here we are combining section 226.8 and 226.9. Through the fun and magic of rulemaking, they say, well, this is a covered incident report. This is a ransomware payment report. And even though 90% of these report requirements are the same, they print both of them instead of just saying do this for both and then these things for each one individually. So that's why the rule just takes so long to get through, because they repeat the same thing multiple times. So here we're talking about sections 226.8 and 226.9. I'll point out as we go through the parts that are unique to covered incident reports and the parts that are unique to ransomware incident reports, which there's actually not that much. It's mostly overlap. Okay. So just to remind everybody, this is what we're saying DFARS 7012 would need to expand to include. These are the kinds of things that you need to report either to DoD or to CISA. One way or another, you're going to give them this information. So they say a covered entity must provide all the information identified in the above section, the boilerplate section we talked about, and the following information in a covered cyber incident ransomware attack report to the extent that such information is available, blah, 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 blah. Okay. A description of the covered cyber incident / ransomware attack, including but not limited to, stick with me here, identification and description of the function of the affected networks, devices, and or information systems that were or are reasonably believed to have been affected by the covered cyber incident ransomware attack, including but not limited to, again, we're indenting even further here, technical details and physical locations of networks, devices, and information systems, whether any such system, network, and or device supports any elements of the intelligence community or contains information that blah, 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 blah is nuclear related, is basically what this section is saying. Okay. Then they say also a description of any unauthorized access, regardless of whether the cyber incident or ransomware attack involved an attributed or unattributed cyber intrusion. So this includes things like identification of any informational impacts or information compromise and any network location where activity was observed, because your network monitoring system is up to date and running and operating, and you have visibility and logging and auditing into your network, correct? Anyways, also, you have to include dates pertaining to the covered cyber incident ransomware attack, including but not limited to the date the covered cyber incident or ransomware attack was detected, the date it began, if fully mitigated and resolved at the time of reporting, the date that it ended, the timeline of compromised system communications with other systems, and for covered cyber incident and ransomware attacks involving unauthorized access, the suspected duration of the unauthorized access prior to detection and reporting. That's a full-blown incident report, incident response timeline construction, right? There are companies that specialize in doing that kind of reconstruction of timelines. When did we think it started? When did we detect it? How long did it last? How long did it take to mitigate? Is it fully mitigated? The timeline of events, what it looks like, all that stuff. That's just one part of this humongous amount of information that they want. They go on under this section. They also want the impact of the covered incident or ransomware attack on the covered entity's operations, such as information related to the level of operational impact and direct economic impacts to operations, any specific or suspected physical or informational impacts, and information to enable CISA's assessment of any known impacts to national security or public health and safety. That's the first paragraph. All right. So the next
1, 2, 3, and 4 are strictly to get the TTPs of whatever actor was there so that they can compile some sort of guidance and directive to send out to the people in that sector that says, hey, you're being targeted. These are the type of things that are happening when you're being targeted. Now, here's a list of recommendations you can take to stop from being targeted when you're targeted, to stop bad things from happening to you, right?
And this is a different conversation, but this is something that it leads into, because the idea that you're going to be required to report these incidents makes perfect sense, because you can't bring the power of the federal government to bear against intrusion sets and ransomware gangs and cyber criminals if they don't have all this reporting information. However, it doesn't work if your network security controls in your network environment don't have the precursors that allow you to get this information to include in the report, right? So if we go through this huge list of information that they want and you go, we don't know, we have no idea what it is, we have no idea what the impacts are, we don't know when it started, we don't know when we detected it, we don't know if it's over, we have no clue what's going on, up is down, left is right, cats and dogs living together, it's not very helpful. And so this is great that we've got the incident reporting law and now this rule coming out, but the elephant in the room is if you don't require that the precursor controls to enable the reports are in place, then you're really putting the cart before the horse. That's
all built on assumption. It's all built on assumption,
Absolutely,
like all of these things are assumed to be in place. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, that's probably a conversation for a different day, but it is something to keep in the back of your mind as you walk through this report, this very thorough and detailed rule. Like, it's all perfectly fine. This is all a noble goal here, but
absolutely,
are you going to get the information that you want when people don't have stuff implemented to enable it? Okay.
It's like open source threat hunting is what it is.
Yeah. So for the second paragraph here, we're only one paragraph in to the second paragraph of things that need to be in the CIRCIA report. The category or categories of any information that was or is reasonably believed to have been accessed or acquired by an unauthorized person or persons. That only applies to covered incident reports, not for ransomware reports. They go on to say, a description of any vulnerabilities exploited, including but not limited to the specific products or technologies and versions of the products or technologies in which the vulnerabilities are found. Because everyone has a good vulnerability management system, we know what our inventory says about our technologies and our versions that are in our environment. Correct? Correct. Okay, the next one, and this is the one that's probably going to make people get a little nervous, a description of the covered entity's security defenses in place, including but not limited to any controls or measures that resulted in the detection or mitigation of the incident. Because of course you have those implemented, and that's how you found out that you had an incident, right? Because you've implemented security controls. Of course everyone has.
Absolutely.
So imagine that, you get just taken down operationally, and then you go to submit this report and you say, we have no idea what's going on and we have no controls in place. Probably not going to be a good day. Okay. Continuing on here, a description of the type of incidents and the tactics, techniques, and procedures used to perpetrate the covered cyber incident or ransomware attack, including but not limited to any tactics, techniques, and procedures used to gain initial access to the covered entity's information systems, escalate privileges, or move laterally, if applicable. Then they continue, any indicators of compromise observed in connection with the covered cyber incident or ransomware attack. So we're going TTPs, IOCs, right? We're trying to get all that threat intel information that you mentioned earlier. They continue, a description and, if possessed by the covered entity, a copy or samples of any malicious software the covered entity believes is connected with the covered cyber incident or ransomware attack, because we all have pretty solid malware analysis capabilities where we can isolate that malicious software and then contain it and then send it back up to CISA if possible. Any identifying information, including but not limited to all available contact information for each actor reasonably believed by the covered entity to be responsible for the incident or ransomware attack. Ransomware actors are very good about providing their contact information. And so if they give you their business card, then CISA would like to know who's ransoming your systems.
Send all gift baskets here.
Yeah, absolutely. They continue in another paragraph, a description of any mitigation and response activities taken by the covered entity in response to the incident or ransomware attack, including but not limited to identification of the current phase of the covered entity's incident response efforts at the time of the report, the covered entity's assessment of the effectiveness of response efforts in mitigating and responding to the incident or ransomware attack, identification of any law enforcement agency that is engaged in responding, including but not limited to information about any specific law enforcement official or point of contact, notifications received from law enforcement, any law enforcement agency that the entity otherwise believes may be involved in investigating the incident or ransomware attack, and whether the entity requested assistance from another entity in response to the incident or ransomware attack, and if so, who are they? And then finally, at the end of the section for covered cyber incidents, any other information or data as required by the web-based CIRCIA incident reporting form or any other manner of form reporting authorized under Section 226.6. That's all the information in addition to the boilerplate that they want from you. If you experience a ransomware situation and you make a ransomware payment, then on top of all of that information, you also need to include the date of the payment, the amount and type of assets used in the payment, the ransom payment demand, including but not limited to, the type and amount of virtual currency, security, commodity, or other form of payment requested, the ransom payment instructions, including but not limited to, information regarding how to transmit the ransom payment, the virtual currency or physical address where the ransom payment was requested to be sent, any identifying information about the ransom payment recipient, information related to the completed payment, any transaction identifier or hash, and outcomes associated with making the ransom payment, including but not limited to, whether any exfiltrated data was returned or a decryption capability was provided, and if so, whether the decryption capability was successfully used by the covered entity. So when 61% of people say, we would like DFARS 7012 to expand to include the requirements of the CIRCIA proposed rule, all of that stuff that we just talked about is going to be in DFARS 7012, and that is going to trigger all of your reporting requirements up to DoD. Now, the only thing that really does is prevent you from having to report one type of incident related to CUI to DoD, and literally every other type of incident possible up to CISA. Does it make it more efficient? Probably. Does it actually reduce the things that you have to report? Not at all, because these are the requirements that are outlined in the law. They're just being implemented via CISA's rule. So one way or another, you're going to have to provide this information. And given what we know about the average implementation rate of 800.171 throughout the DIB, I don't think it's a stretch to say that most companies with average implementation would not be able to provide this information to CISA after experiencing one of those four impacts and or paying a ransom, which is a big problem because when CISA says we'd like to know what's going on, we have a statute that says we get to know what's going on, and you say we don't know what's going on because we haven't implemented any controls. That's going to be a tough day.
It's a form to give them that says give us information, any information that you know, but it's also a form that does a bit of revelation for the organization, right? Because you're going in there and you're answering questions about things that possibly you have contractually attested that you're doing. And as you go through and answer the questions, you're telling them, I am not doing this. For example, if I'm an organization and I have to report to CIRCIA because a software was exploited, and then they go and say, well, what version of the software are you operating? And it's 2.0. And then they look on the software's website, and the latest version of that software that's secure and approved is 4.2.4, right? Then you realize there's so many variations of the software out. You haven't been remediating vulnerabilities. You've just told on yourself that you aren't keeping up, because then the next says, are there any controls applicable to this, et cetera, et cetera? And you're basically saying, hey, I attested DFARS 7012 that I have applicable, the minimum security baseline implemented, and vulnerability management is a part of that. And now I'm telling you in this form that I had to fill out on your fancy website that I haven't been doing that.
Yeah. Well, so here's an interesting thing that I just thought of as you were saying that. Let's say that the machinery of government lines up in such a way that DoD contractors only have to report incidents, CIRCIA or otherwise, to DoD, and then DoD hands that information off to CISA. Well, under the section where it says a description of the covered entity's security defenses in place, including but not limited to controls or measures that resulted in the detection or mitigation of the incident. What happens if you get to say, we're CMMC certified, leave us alone? Those are the requirements that you guys set. We met the bar. We have the certification, so you can't come back on us and say you didn't do enough, or you ought to have been doing this, or, well, you have these controls, but we don't think that's sufficient. You should have had these controls. They can't do that anymore because you met the requirement. They said, this is what you have to meet. And
it's not just a meet at a deadline and then you stop meeting it, right? Isn't it a continuous implementation?
Well, it's a continuous implementation, but what I'm saying is that it gives you the top cover because let's say CMMC certifications don't exist. Imagine a world where CMMC certifications don't exist, right? And then you report that you had this incident, and then you describe your control environment, and the government comes back and says, well, we don't think that's sufficient. And then you get into this back and forth. This happens with FTC all the time. Some major corporation will experience a massive cyber incident. Think Target, Home Depot as some of the examples that come to mind, Equifax. And FTC will turn around and they'll read the incident reports, they'll do the after actions, and they'll say, okay, these are all the things that you had in place. These are all the things that you did. We don't think that was reasonable. The reasonable baseline was something else. So we're going to give you a 20-year injunction, and we're going to be all up in your Cheerios because we think that the baseline should be something else. If there is a certification baseline,
you can think that the baseline is supposed to be something, but the certification baseline's been set there, and contractually and legally, it says that I have to meet this minimum requirement.
Correct. So if there is such a certification and you have to submit this report, it
doesn't say if you do more, you get extra credit. We're saying that's great security. We're saying that's good things for you to do, but we're not saying that somebody can come back and levy an injunction on you because they felt like the minimum baseline you put in place. F you mean?
Well, that's what I'm saying, though.
You know what I mean? Like I'm serious though. Like,
well, this happens all the time. This happens all the time where a company will experience something bad. Look at what's happening with SolarWinds and the SEC. They experience like one of the worst compromises in the history of the United States.
Cool, change your regulations then. You are the government. You are regulating all this.
Okay,
pardon my language. That's dude. Hold on, time out, dude. A year and a half, and that's the first time that we slipped, dude.
That's great.
But do you get what I'm saying? Like, what do you mean? You're telling me that I didn't do enough? You're the person regulating it, and the regulation that you have put forward and went through all the hoops to put into place says that this is what the minimum requirement is,
Correct.
right?
That happens as long as there's a regulation in place that says there is a minimum requirement, right? When there is no such regulation that allows you to prove that you've met a minimum requirement, it opens the door to the government always coming back and going, well, we think that this is actually what's reasonable, not what you did.
Yeah.
And there have been a parade of companies that have had FTC injunctions as a result of this. And so if you're submitting these reports and you get to say, we met the requirement and we can prove that we met the requirement via the CMMC certification, it gives you a lot more top cover than if we say, well, we attested to implementing everything and actually everything's been on a POAM for the last 7 years, right? It gets much dicier that way. But anyway,
absolutely.
I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. The point of this episode is to let everybody know that if you're a DIB contractor or subcontractor, this rule applies to you. There are 4 different kinds of reports that can stem from either ransomware payments or 4 different impacts to your systems and networks. And if either of those 2 things happen, you need to submit a report up to the government. And there's a ton of information inside of those reports that if you don't have your control environment fully established and you don't have somebody operating it who knows what they're doing, you probably won't be able to meet the reporting requirements that are inside of that rule. Now, for the sake of everybody's sanity, we're going to wait for another episode to talk about reporting exceptions, to talk about data retention requirements, and to talk about enforcement and subpoena actions that they could take. And that should round out, I think, our coverage of the rule at a high level in terms of the primer, the content of the reports, and some of the gotchas that can come with it. But comments on the CIRCIA proposed rule are due on June 3rd. As of right now, they have not extended that comment period. So we'll link to the episode that we did a couple months ago about how to craft effective public comments. But if you're listening to this podcast and you're an MSP or you're a defense contractor or subcontractor, I cannot stress enough, this rule is coming for you. It is 100% real. And CISA and DoD are too busy fighting, really, probably, to make it go away. And I don't even think that's possible. So you need to be paying attention to it. And like I said, comments due June 3rd. CS2 replay coming up soon. may the odds forever be in your favor.
I hope that they're more in favor than the 17% of incident reporting that happens in the DoD right now.
Is that really the stat?
I think it's like 17. It's some
We'll have to go. We'll have to set
number.
up Terry Kalka's report.
Because that's what baffles me about the whole thing is that, like, and you made the comments throughout the show, and I know we're wrapping up here, but you made the comments throughout the show, like, if you have this implemented, that's true too.
Week.
Yeah, see you next week.